Our moderator today is Professor Sanford Ungar, the director of the Free Speech Project here at Georgetown University. Sandy comes to us with extensive experience in both academics and journalism. He is President Emeritus of Goucher College and has decades of experience in both print and broadcast journalism. He's the author of newspaper and magazine articles, as well as being the author-editor of 6 books. So we really could not ask for somebody with more perfect experience for this program. Our 4 expert panelists here represent our faculty as well as print and broadcast journalism, and they all overlap with the different things that they've been working on. So I look forward to a wonderful discussion full of insights into the hows and whys of working with popular and social media. And with that, I would like to turn it over to our wonderful panel and Sandy Ungar, who will moderate for us.
Thanks, Meg. Yeah, another way to introduce me, it would have been briefer, would have been to say that scholars find me too journalistic and journalists find me too scholarly. So, in some fashion, I'm the perfect hybrid or the imperfect hybrid, given my experience. This is a subject that I think a lot of us think about even when we don't know we're thinking about it, which is how to communicate the work that people are doing that has such great value, and sometimes it seems very difficult to get notice for it. Are you able to hear me? Do we have to worry about microphones? Okay, good. And so I think we have plenty of time to explore this. So we will. I will ask some questions of people on the panel, and then we'll discuss things amongst ourselves and have lots of time for your questions and comments, which I hope you'll keep brief. And when you do have a question or comment, please introduce yourself. So I think we should get right into this with trying to treat this issue of how do we, in this particular moment in a world beset and besieged, and sometimes it feels like we're drowning in information and communication, how do we get important ideas out and recognized, and how do we package them, if you will, so that people will give them the attention they deserve? And I thought I'd start with Deborah Tannen, who really, when they give out awards for this, they should be giving Deborahs, like Emmys, because she really has managed over time to communicate her very serious scholarly interest in a way that people have picked up upon. And so, Deborah, I think what I'd really like you to do for a start, if you don't mind, is sort of just give us a little narrative of how this happened, how you as a scholar became such a popular communicator.
Well, yeah, so can you all hear me? You might be sort of surprised that I was never an expert on gender, and that was a total out of left field thing for me. I got my PhD at Berkeley, and cross-cultural communication was my area of interest. My dissertation was comparing New York Jewish conversational style to California conversational style. I was one of the New York Jewish speakers in the study. But I had realized that whenever I was out in just the average world, I would tell a little bit about the kind of stuff I was doing, and people were interested. And I felt like psychologists had been really effective at communicating to the outside world, and linguists had not. I also sometimes say I wanted to write a book that my mother could read. My parents did not graduate from high school, although my father became a lawyer, complicated story, immigrant story. But both my parents were born in Europe, and my mother was really not an intellectual, and my father could read my academic articles, my mother could not. So I was pretty much used to talking to people who were not formally educated. So that's how I got the interest in doing it. And I started right out writing for magazines. So have my dissertation on New York Jewish conversational style. Had an academic article on the subject, and I already was writing my academic articles in a very conversational, non-academic way, and that's kind of an interesting when you said that about journalists and scholars. When anyone in the popular world doesn't like what I've done, they tell me it's too scholarly, too academic, and when anyone in the academic world wants to be critical, they say it's too pop.
Yep.
So, yeah.
As Ronald Reagan would say, you must be doing something right.
Or everything wrong. So I just started by sending that academic article to all the magazines within New York identities. So New York Magazine, New York Review of Books, New York Times, and New York Magazine picked it up. So I wrote an article in a popular vein for them. So the one question is, how was I able immediately to move to that other voice? And that really is, I think, the big challenge for most academics, changing your voice. But I think it's something that I had because of that background. I was 30 when I started grad school in linguistics, so I really had not been socialized as an academic as much as a writer. And my BA and MA were English literature, so I always wrote. That's something that always lead me. So that's pretty much how it happened. I had that article in New York Magazine. I was contacted by someone, an editor at Vogue Magazine, asking, can you do the same thing for women and men? I did it. A little interesting, tiny little backstory of that. I sent her something, and then I said, I really wasn't very good, and I rewrote it, and I said, please use this one instead. And she said, I like the first one, you did better. And it was kind of a lesson in not overthinking the voice that I was speaking in. So then it was getting an agent, and I was lucky that my academic publisher was on the board of one of the commercial presses, and he recommended an agent. And having published those articles, I think that's the first thing that book editors are worried about, that you won't be able to sound not academic. But what's, I guess, another little piece there. The first book that I wrote for general audiences was not You Just Didn't Understand. It was a book called That's Not What I Meant. And that was the book for which I had ambitions. I thought, this is going to change the world. Everyone's going to realize that linguistics is also a way to understand what's happening in relationships. It isn't all psychology, and what you think is psychology or pathology might really just be ways of speaking, which was really the kernel of my work on your Jewish conversational style. Now I'm talking about that. I'm using my hand and I'm talking faster. I'm demonstrating what I'm talking about. But yeah, so a tiny little thing like length of pause would result in the New Yorker seeming to interrupt, but that really wasn't the reason. It wasn't the motivation. It was about thinking the other person had nothing to say, or something I called cooperative overlapping. You talk along to show enthusiasm, not because you want the other person to stop. And when they stop, they've created the interruption, not the person who started. So that was all what I thought I was messianic about. And the book, That's Not What I Meant, did okay, but not that big a deal. And I scaled back my ambitions. And I remember at that point talking to someone, a journalist who wrote books for the general audience, and he said, the goal is for the book to do well enough for them to let you write another one. And I thought that was good, and I scaled back my ambitions that way. And then I wrote about the gender just because that was what people seemed to want to talk about from the book. That's not what I meant. I had one chapter on women and men, and that's what everybody wanted to talk about. So I wrote the book You Just Didn't Understand and had no idea what was going to happen. So that's another item. Maybe I'll close with that. When something does get a lot of attention, people always say to me, well, of course it's the topic, it was the time, you knew it was the right time. I don't always know, and in fact, I never really know what people are gonna pick up on. Yeah. So it was that the gender issue was what everyone wanted to talk about, and now I'm the gender lady, which was not what I set out to be. And then I wrote several books after that. The next book I wrote that was a major bestseller was the book about mothers and daughters called You Weren't That. And the same thing, everyone said, well, of course, it's the topic. You knew that would be a bestseller. And well, if I knew, I would have written it 10 years before. So that's kind of how it happened.
You know, your mention of talking with your hands reminds me of a story. I used to work in radio, and when I first came to work in radio, I was from an alien world, not necessarily academia, but print. And so I would talk a lot with my hands, and somebody once said to me, you know, the audience can't see your hands. And so for a while, I had to sit on my hands in order to make my voice more expressive. And that for me has been a sort of emblematic lesson. Here I am talking with my hands. That for me has been an emblematic lesson in trying to use one's voice, not just one's voice broadly speaking, in a way that will reach more people. Marcia, I wanted you to tell us about you seem to be quite a good communicator too.
Well,
So I'm interested in your story.
Okay,
How you got to be a good communicator.
So I was in my high school speech team. So Sister Diane Weissenbach, I owe everything to her because at a kind of young formative age, I became comfortable speaking in front of audiences. And increasingly I see what a gift that is, especially for girls and young women, to have the confidence to get up and talk in front of people. So my high school speech coach was first. And I think the second influence for me in my scholarly trajectory was I actually went to journalism school. So I was a magazine journalism major. Actually, Autumn and I went to college together, and we were kind of that last group that just did one thing. So now if we went to journalism school, we would learn how to take video and make podcasts, but we learned one thing, and I learned magazine writing.
Where did you go to journalism school?
The University of Missouri. And I was
the original?
Yes, I was an incredibly mediocre journalism student, and I was told that I was good but not great. And the Missouri School of Journalism was a place for people who were great. So I discovered that I did have a passion for research and writing, but I think at the core of it, as I think about, this is my 10th year as a professor, is that at the core of everything I do is a desire to advance racial and economic justice, and I just do that as a professor. And so if that is the core of what I do, then the outward-facing work that I do is also kind of goes back to that. And so I've just had some great opportunities to be able to communicate on different platforms outside of academia. And I think later I'll go through the different tools that I use to do it. But I think the thing that I just want to say is that sometimes the term public intellectual is kind of used as a slur against our colleagues. This person wants to be a public intellectual, meaning they either want to dumb down their work or they just want to get on television. But I was really moved by what Deborah was saying. As a person who comes from a family in which most people did not attend college, television is a really powerful tool. I learned my best material from TV as a kid. Most of my family members, after a long day of work, they're watching the news all day long. And so for me, the opportunity to do what I do in the classroom at a different scale on television or radio or in podcasts, I think is of critical importance. And I think that the more and more we get comfortable doing that kind of popular education, I think we make a stronger case for ourselves, especially in the humanities, as we find ourselves under attack. We open up just the new possibilities of engagement. And so I really do feel honored that, if I do a small segment that might be a minute and, 30 seconds on CNN, which, required about an hour of makeup and 90 seconds of my best thoughts, that I will get emails from, I was watching this with my kids and I was able to talk to them about X, Y, and Z, right? Those are the classrooms that I think that we need to be in. The second thing I'm going to say, I want to say about communication was the best advice I ever got was from Ula Taylor, who's a historian at UC Berkeley. And she had a mentoring role for me in a fellowship program. And she said, after I published my first book and got tenure, I didn't rush to my second book. I wanted to experiment with form. And I thought, that's bad advice. Don't you want to just write your second book so that crisis is over in your life and you can move on? But I think it was the best advice that I ever received because I started to think about essay writing. So I started writing some pieces for the Chronicle. I did a popular book review for the Washington Post, and then I joined a nationally available or an internationally available podcast where I had to write scripts every week. And experimenting with form has been such a good preparation for writing my second book that is with a trade publication that requires straddling that academic and public voice. And so I think for scholars who are approaching tenure or approaching a second project and you feel like you don't have the full steam, my colleague Chandra Manning reminded me that, you know, when you write your first book based on your dissertation, you will never have that kind of lifestyle or time again to think about an idea. It just doesn't happen for you. And so before you dive into that second project, experimenting with form can be such a helpful communication tool. And I think radio, television, that is also a form that you can experiment with in terms of getting your ideas out there.
So, Autumn, you have been on the receiving end of great work and the great thoughts of academics, and I skipped introducing all our panelists because you have very extensive introductions available to you, but Autumn worked at the Post and the Wall Street Journal and got people's voices magnified with her work. So to ask a very basic question, what were you looking for? How did you choose? How did you go about this?
Well, let me give you a little bit of background.
Can everyone hear Autumn?
Can you hear me?
You might need to use the actual mic. There are supposedly hidden microphones in this room someplace. Which are picking up our voices, so.
Now, can you hear me? Hello?
That's only for the camera.
Is it working now?
It's just
It's
for
not,
the
it's only
video.
for the camera.
Oh,
It's
that's-
not, it doesn't project through the chat.
Okay, so just speak up,
I will
just.
speak up. So, I worked in the editorial section at the Post. I was an editor in the editorial department of the Post for 3 years before I started editing the op-ed page. And when I started editing the op-ed page, the memo that I wrote about the job asked a lot of questions about what do we think of when we think of an op-ed. That I felt like I had looked at the page for a long time and, you know, I'd just spent a few years working kind of closely with it. And I felt like the Post had sort of a very traditional approach of an op-ed is 800 printed words, and actually in some cases sort of 900, or in Henry Kissinger's case, 1600. It just seemed to sort of have one answer, but I thought that maybe, you know, especially as I was kind of looking at blogs were, you know, kind of exploding and people were just thinking about things differently, why did an op-ed only have to be 800 words? Could people express themselves more visually? Like, could we, if the goal of an op-ed was to have a smart conversation about an issue of importance, if it was potentially not to break news, but to teach you a new thing about a familiar subject or help you find a different way to understand sort of a problem that's out there, couldn't we explain things in different ways than the traditional print approach? And so I was kind of trying to balance that with, at the time I started editing the op-ed page at the Post, we received on average 60 to 100 unsolicited submissions a day. And so in busy times, like I think the following year was the 2008 presidential campaign, and that the Democratic primary went on into June, and we got lots of submissions. The numbers were very high.
Did you read them all?
And not all of them. So I shared the op-ed submissions with the editorial page editor and the deputy editorial page editor, and together, sort of, they were all read, unless if they started out with like a string of profanity, I can't say that those were read. But I think everyone made a good faith effort to look at a piece and really understand what is this trying to tell us. And if it was very clearly, I really think that you need to invest in this housing project. Like if it was not a serious piece but some sort of, you know, promotion or something, like those we could sort of quickly weed through. I would say in a given day, if you got 100 unsolicited pieces, you could narrow those down pretty quickly to 20 that you're going to spend more time considering. And then of those 20, you narrow it down to, say, maybe 5. And then of those 5...
The odds are low.
Well, yes. And so that's, of those 5, then I'm looking at those pieces, and I'm looking at the topics, and I'm checking in with our columnists to see what are they writing? Like, what are the people who generally already have a claim on that space? planning to contribute. And so if there's an outside contributor who's writing on something, but one of our columnists is already writing on something, then the outside contributor probably isn't going to get in unless they're making a vastly different point on the same topic. I think if you look at the post, there's something like 8 or 9 spaces for outside contributors in print every week. Now with Global Opinions, they publish much more online. But at the same time, and I did check with my former colleagues earlier this summer, they're now getting, on average, between 100 and 200 unsolicited pieces a day. So that doesn't even get into the pieces that they're thinking, oh, we should get so-and-so to write about this, and reaching out and really asking people to send things in. The competition is stiff. And so you're sort of looking at things trying to understand, well, one, I think most newspaper editors really have the metric, does this say something new? Does it say something new and different? Does it actually make news? And if it doesn't make news, does it give you a new way to understand a familiar problem, a chance to sort of approach a real important issue in a way that, you know, isn't out there, that could really get people talking? And you know, on the one hand, it's wonderful to have an opportunity to get to read so many great ideas, and on the other hand, you get to accept probably less than 1%. So even getting to work with a lot of, you know, very high quality pieces, not a lot gets in.
But you must feel very well informed after reading this.
Yes, and that I think probably a lot of editors I know, and I sort of made decisions. I know that one editor used to say, there needs to be something on the page every day that I disagree with. And
That's a good guideline.
I don't know that I ever needed to feel like I disagreed with something. Another editor at the Post used to say, okay, how am I satisfying my Tyson's Corner mom? Like, he wanted to make sure there was something out there that could appeal to, like, the soccer moms in his neighborhood. I tended to think, okay, is there something on this page that I want to read, that my dad would want to read, and that my boss would want to read? So is there something here that is personally satisfying to me, or educational to me, or that, you know, this piece will sort of interest my dad, or, you know, what's the mix, what's the balance of things here? And then sort of trying to figure out kind of the balance of what are people looking for, and what do we think they need to know about? Not everybody is thinking, perhaps in July, there are elections coming in Kenya next month, that, you know, there was a very violent history here. How do we understand this? Maybe it's a good thing if actually the election isn't certified. And that's not necessarily something that probably will get, you know, a lot of page views, but it's still an important topic. It's a thing to understand about, perhaps, you know, it's not going to get as much sort of headline attention as maybe Afghanistan or Iraq, but it's still an issue that, you know, you would want people to pay attention to.
Right. Danielle, you work in what I still think of as sort of the perfect medium, because people can listen pretty effectively while doing other things, while transitioning between things. When I worked at All Things Considered, I used to be amazed by the range of people who listened and who responded to things. They were not the audience we thought. So how do you talk about competition for space, airtime in your case? How do you guys go about, I mean, Danielle you did work for Diane Rehm, right?
Yes.
For the Diane Rehm show, which everyone thought couldn't ever be replaced, and has now been replaced by something called 1A, which I believe has more listeners, more stations, even than Diane Rehm had. And is
But different stations.
I'm sorry?
But different stations.
Different stations.
Yeah, different listeners, which is
Tell us about that, actually, that distinction. I think people would be interested in knowing. You've gone through a major transition at the station and on this program. What's the difference in how you're communicating now from before?
Well, I think it's probably no surprise that it's a younger audience, a more urban audience. Like Autumn said, though, we are trying to appeal to many different people, and sometimes that's difficult when you're constructing a show. And we're also, in terms of our approach to stories, is that we are relying a lot more on the audience to generate content, coming up with ideas, telling us what's important to them, and having that online or digital, or even, phone calls where, listening more to people soliciting ideas. Not so much as the Diane Ring show did. I mean, they were definitely, callers were part of the conversation while it was happening live, but this is also kind of influencing future shows to come. So it's a different approach. And then having that online or by phone or by email conversation influence the on-air conversation and vice versa. So that's a very different approach. And we'll get we'll just this week we had a trauma surgeon from call us up from New Mexico and say you really need to be focusing on wounded victims, not just the shooting, and look at all these other and it was something we hadn't thought of as a focus for a whole show, and then we did a whole show on that because somebody reached out in that way, and it turned out to be a really compelling conversation with victims and also medical professionals and professionals that looked at the financial burdens this has on families and society, as well as a psychologist who can talk about that aspect of mass shootings when everybody else is looking at gun control or the history of the shooter. So it's very rewarding, and then because you're coming up with ideas in a very different way, and not just relying on the op-ed page to say, oh, what's the latest in the paper, because there's other things. People have great ideas that are not writing op-eds or have a podcast or that are right there on the ground, and we can get direct communication with people like that. So it's a different approach. And one thing I wanted to follow up on that Deborah talked about was changing your voice. Something that we do both on the Diane Ring show and on 1A is we pre-interview everybody that comes on. So we're a different medium. This is it's different than print. Somebody's not expressing themselves. They could be a fantastic writer, but then speaking on live radio is a totally different thing. And even speaking in a pre-interview with a producer is a different thing. And people get nervous. They don't know exactly where to begin. So we preview every guest that comes on, and we're looking for, is this compelling? Are you putting this in context? Can I understand what you're saying? Are you speaking in bureaucratese? Are you speaking in legalese? Are you speaking on all medical terms? Is it all abbreviations? Or is it just kind of a language and esoteric? It could be just something that's very familiar with them, like I'm trying to think of an example, or like a medical professional just speaking all in specific terms that I can't follow the conversation, and also I can't, I'm not putting it in a larger context because it's so rarefied and so focused. So yeah.
I have a sort of inside baseball question for you that I can remember being a problem when I was working in radio, which is that don't you worry in some of those pre-interviews that the best lines will be spent and very hard to reproduce during the actual?
And that does happen.
It happens a lot.
It does, and people, I think, because they're not on live and their guard is down, with you, and they'll be a lot. They're much more comfortable, and they're probably in a quiet place. They're not in the studio. They're in their home or something. They're contemplative, and yes. But what I try to do as a producer, and if there is this bit of gold there, and a compelling story, or a really beautiful quote, or the way they phrased something or summed up a trend or whatever it is, I try to put that in the script, in the background materials for Joshua or for Diane.
So that he'll prompt that.
He'll say, so I gather there was this story about such and such, or oh, I gather this happened, whatever it may be, and then that usually will help, but it doesn't always work.
I want to go back to something that Marcia said that I thought was very interesting. When you were talking about CNN in this sort of 90 seconds sometimes, and you used the word prompting. You may not have meant it in the way that I took it, but it seems to me that what a scholar can do in that circumstance is prompt people to think about something that they might not have been thinking about until you, in this very condensed, effective manner, brought it up. I just, do you have any examples when you've done that?
So I'm not a regular contributor. I'm kind of the summer break bench. So when all the people who are really, who get asked to be on cable news a lot, when they're all gone on vacation, and they're like, sometimes a producer will contact you like 90 minutes before a show. It's like, we're really excited to have you on. It can't be about your ego. But you get your makeup done professionally, so you can go take pictures afterward. But in terms of, I think, what scholars can do that talking heads can't, is that we have a body of knowledge where we can point people into directions and reframe a conversation. And so after Georgetown released their working group report on slavery, memory, and reconciliation, a lot of the hot takes were this admissions policy change. Oh, so do you think this admissions policy change is enough for reparations? That's like, it's not a good question, right? But I understand where it comes from. And so I think what I can say is, actually, the conversation about reparations is as old as the abolition of slavery. And everyone has grappled with this in different generations. The question is, will we be the one to actually solve this problem? When we think about inequality in housing, the criminal justice system, and health. So there are many ways where we can try to repair this breach that we have this history of, right? So this is a way to add a little bit more dimension. I don't think I was talking for more than 90 seconds, but it's to make clear that when scholars come on your show, they're going to bring the big ideas. And I think it encourages the producers to have more scholars come on the show, so that at the end of the show, if the producer says, that was great, I can say, oh, I have 39 colleagues on a number of topics who can do that same thing. And I think that that's also something that I really want to raise. There are a number of things I don't talk about publicly, either because I'm not the smartest person on this topic, or I don't want to join that conversation. And I think that for people who want to do this type of work, you decide what kind of conversations you don't want to be part of. And so then you have all of your colleagues say, but who would be great on this conversation? Or who's really good? And I think that producers trust you a little bit more. I think they value...
When you're recommending someone
else. When you recommend other people, or when you say, this isn't my party, because I think what you don't want is to be a caricature of the person who's going to weigh in on everything. I think you become grating to yourself and to the public. And so I think that the ways that we have a body of knowledge to not only kind of add a larger frame, but direct people to really good resources. So when I go on a show, in my little cheat sheet, I always have like 3 or 4 websites that have easy names to say, if you really want to make a difference, go to, wewatchwatchers.org, and they have some great resources, and find other ways to help people really learn something at the end of your segment.
Or how about freespeechproject.georgetown.edu?
I will keep that one in mind.
Good. Deborah, you, when you were talking about voice, you said, one of the ways that I would summarize what you said is look for a topic to which you can apply the work you've been doing and the skills that you have. It sounded to me like you were often trying to be strategic in what you were going to write about next, or where you were going to apply things. And I just wonder if you have some advice for people about that, people who've been sort of laboring in the vineyards, studying important things, but not finding the way to apply those to current issues.
Yeah, it's a good question. As I said, I started with this mission that I was going to communicate about linguistics to a larger audience. I wasn't sure and had no way to know what corner of that would be the most appealing.
And it wasn't going to be hard to improve upon the communication of linguistics knowledge, right?
Starting with nobody knowing anything about it.
Right.
But yeah, and I think this is a challenge, and has been a challenge for me. how much I'm gonna listen to what an agent or an editor tells me would be good to do versus what I feel like doing and in an organic sort of way grows out of what I did before. And so there's maybe an interesting little PS to that about writing you just don't understand rather than after the book, that's not what I meant, did not catch on as I thought it would. I was gonna write a collection of essays, and when my agent suggested I should write about gender, my first reaction was no. In fact, when I came to Georgetown, I was the second woman in a department of 18, and then the other one left. And it was me for a number of years. And then we hired one more woman, and that was it for another 10 years. So when I was hired, the one other woman said, why don't you teach a course on gender and language? Not only did I say no, but I was insulted. Yes, I'm a woman, but that's not my area of expertise. Why should I teach that? So my first reaction was that my agent said, why don't you write the language of work and then you can write the language of love or something like that. And I said, no way, that's not me, I'm not doing it. But I actually had a longer talk with her where she convinced me that I could do it in a way that was fully academic, using my expertise, and she said, look, write a proposal that way, and if they want it, fine, and if they don't want it, we'll drop it. And so it was kind of a compromise.
So you were in some ways steered by your agent.
I was, and that still happens, and I think it's tricky. I'm a kind of agreeable kind of person, I think many women are. My inclination is to do what I'm told. And I often have to back off and say, do I really want to do this? And keep a...
Not everyone has an agent, and it's not always, it's sort of like what Autumn was describing. Very significant, influential agents get, I don't know how many approaches a day, a week, a year, people wanting to become their clients, and it's not easy. Do you have any advice on finding an agent?
That is the trick, yeah. People ask me how can I find a publisher, and I say, you need to find an agent. I guess I was lucky because I had those pieces I had written for magazines, and enough of a angle that seemed new,
Sure.
kind of what
so you could show that you could write for your mother.
Yeah. But so I often say to people, start by writing, and at that time it would have been magazines, now it could even be a blog, but something that people can see that you can write.
Right.
And just a little PS, I think the same thing comes up in writing op-eds and things like that. I don't control what I'm going to say to the extent that I do in academic writing, and I still do academic writing, and each one is kind of a relief from the other, because when I kind of flee from one to the other, and in my academic writing, I basically can write what I think I should, and with popular writing, it could be the editor, and I've worked with Autumn as an editor, and she's great. But I certainly have had experiences where editors want me to do things that I don't think I should do. And if it's an op-ed, the timing is so tight. Yeah. You have like 20 minutes to get back to them because we've got to close. And so that, that can be frustrating. And sometimes I do let things go that wouldn't be exactly what I want.
Actually, there's a point I wanted to come to Autumn on, but you just mentioned timing, which I don't want to lose that thread right now. In this electronic digital era, the speed with which ideas get processed, come sort of out of the faucet and drunk and move on to another, is really astonishing. And I've had the experience, I still write some op-ed pieces myself, and I will send somebody I know an email or have a phone conversation and say it's Thursday, and I say I'll have a draft to you by Monday, and thinking, well, I'll use the weekend to think things over, and by Monday, World War III has arrived in the meantime, and who remembers last week's agenda? And I think this has been exacerbated by our particular political circumstances of the moment. So, I have a hard time with that, because I can't just turn out trenchant, brilliant idea. I mean, I can eventually, but I can't do it on demand. I just can't produce a piece by, it's 10 minutes to 11 now. It would be very risky for me to say, okay, by 3 o'clock this afternoon, I'll have something in the computer for you, because I need to think it through, and I need to clear my throat, and I need to have a swim, and I need to... So what do you do? What do we do when things are turning over and happening so fast? I mean, this must be a hazard for you, Danielle, as well. A show that seems perfect on Monday by Wednesday might seem like it was last year.
Yeah, it is relentless. Well, we often change shows too.
I'm sure you do.
But we also return to things that, we hope to return to things that become forgotten. Everything was about, I'm just using this week as an example, everything was about Las Vegas and the shooting. Meanwhile, I kept thinking, we all kept thinking about Puerto Rico, and those voices getting lost. And when the hurricane had hit Houston, we had done a whole week on Houston. And why? There was a lot more reporters there. There was a lot more resources there. There was a lot more political representation there. Whereas in Puerto Rico, you're not having that kind of.
And it was the first of the season too.
Yeah, right, the first. And so we try to keep things on our radar that sometimes get drowned out in kind of all of the noise. But it's a challenge.
Autumn, do you have some thoughts about that? How to stay current without, losing your mind?
So I think one thing that was really useful, actually, like a key point, the 3 words that Danielle just said that I think anybody in this room could do on your radar. Particularly academics know their subject area, they know the things that are happening, the important things that are coming up that, journalists will try to be aware of, but are not going to be as well versed in particular subject areas. And so to the extent that it's possible sometimes when you know that something is going to be happening in the future, that you can reach out ahead of time and say, this thing is coming and I'm an expert on this and it makes sense for me to write about this and here's why your audience needs to know about it. I think there's a sweet spot. For me, the sweet spot can be honestly anywhere between 2 days and 3 weeks. Like enough time that you can send an email or call someone and they have time to get the message, not necessarily the instant that you wrote it, but maybe either after the meeting that they were in or at the end of the long day when they're cleaning out their inbox. And they can process it and maybe check on the things that they need to check on and get back to you, and you have time to have a back and forth before suddenly a deadline is hitting you. Somebody sent something once when I was op-ed editor of the Post. I think it was a Father's Day piece that came kind of 3 months ahead of Father's Day. It was great. It's a bit early, but honestly, I was it was an unexpected thing. I think honestly it came in March. And it was this unexpected thing, and I was sort of like, I have no idea why he sent this now, but this is fine, and we'll just hold on to it until then. And so I might have been, I'm not saying I was the person who was waited until 2 hours before deadline to get back, but I pushed it off and kind of didn't get to it until June. But for the most part, you don't want to reach out to publications so far ahead of your ideal time frame that they forget about the thing that you're trying to tell them about. And then, at the moments when something happens and it's sort of right in your wheelhouse and you're kind of the person, then I think you want to sort of think, what can you contribute? And if you look at, a lot of publications in particular, Sunday newspaper sections, like the New York Times Week in Review and the Washington Post Sunday Outlook section, if you go look at them, very rarely will you see something that was clearly, this happened on Friday and this piece could only have been written on Saturday. they've thought about what's coming and they've tried to pose questions to people or approach things in such a way that they're telling you about something that's about to be relevant to you, but it's written in a way that this could work, even if, you know, it happened to be done 4 days ahead of time.
Can I say something about that?
Yep.
Go ahead, Marcia.
In my experience working with the Chronicle of Higher Ed, their review is a really good place for this very thing. So one of the things that happens is you put out one piece, and then like 11 editors ask you if you were working on a book, if you've got anything else, and you're just like, I'm just trying to teach class. Please, you know, it's that overwhelming feeling where you're really honored, but you're thinking, I just have to make it through this week. And so anytime I get a solicitation, my first one was from the Chronicle, do you have anything you're working on? I don't have anything I'm working on right now, but can we open up this line of communication? And so when the University of Missouri protests erupted, I'm an alum, I had very strong feelings, I could go back to that editor and say, I actually have something, and I was able to write it very quickly because I felt so strongly about it, but it was able to be in the review, so it was online and in print. And so those are also other ways that sometimes you can feel like your graduate advisor is asking you for another chapter of your dissertation and you feel like you have to perform immediately, but I think those relationships have been helpful. So after Charlottesville, I had an idea for a piece as well, and I could, an editor contacted me and because I had a sense of the timing, it was easier to do. And the other thing I just wanted to say for the academics in the room, I try to keep like a notebook of 3 things: anecdotes, threads, and anniversaries. So if I want to do a popular piece that I know it'll be the 50th anniversary of X, then I can frame it in terms of a timeline because editors really respond well to that. Or if there is a thread that I would like to see, you know, whatever, you know, how to write. But if there's some anecdote that can be used later for a piece, I try to collect them so that if there's quick turnaround, I have access to these ideas that I've been thinking about.
I think another useful thing that Marcia just said there was conversation. And so I know there are a lot of journalists who, like, one of the experiences that Deborah talked about, you know, sometimes an editor will ask for something and then a writer might say, well, that's not really the piece I want to write, or I think this other angle is more important. And in my experience, it can go both ways. Sometimes, you know, as an editor, you're really looking for a particular question to be answered. There were times when I would get unsolicited op-ed submissions and I would read something and then write back to the person and say, I think this particular paragraph is really interesting, and if you could write a different piece that actually goes into this, that would be something that we'd be interested in. And honestly, I never really understood this, quite a lot of times people would write back and say, no, I want to do this. And so it was kind of like, okay, well this particular piece doesn't work for us. I've told you what might work for us. And you can make your choice. But at the same time, you know, there were plenty of times when I would reach out to people and say, I think this thing is coming up and we'd be interested in you writing something. The same way that, you know, when you're having conversations with journalists and sometimes the journalist will ask you, is there anything I didn't ask you that you wish I would have asked? Or just when you're speaking about something or you understand this is the particular thing that's important, I think you can always go back to an editor and say, okay, you know, you've given me an opportunity to do this thing, but here's the thing that people who are really interested in this are going to want to know. An editor's going to be happy that, you know, the thing that they're about to publish or broadcast, produce, however they're putting it out to readers, they're getting the most important, you know, salient facts to readers.
Autumn, I feel I'm compelled to ask you, does the Father's Day story have a happy ending? Did you publish the piece in June, 3 months later?
Yes. So that was I remember once being with, I went to a panel at Stanford, and a group of us had gone out to dinner one night, and one person kept stepping away, and he came back to the table and he said, Wall Street Journal's had my thing for 2 months and they're only editing it now, the night before it's going in. And I was just sort of thinking, yay, it's not me.